Welcome everyone. Thanks for coming this evening to the College of St. Ben's observance of Martin Luther King Day stuff. We've got some folks to thank before we go too far into the main presentation this evening. Here at St. Ben's, we're lucky to work with some people who realize that before you talk about diversity, you should think about it. And that good intentions without good work is not good enough. And so I think we need to take a moment to thank Vice President Mary Geller, Navy Cultural Directions Council, who are the folks who made tonight happen. And more specifically, more concretely, I think we should all give it up for Brandon Woodard, who virtually single-handedly brought her here. He almost flew the plane. So if we could please... Tonight, you're lucky to benefit from the industry of people like Brandon who do this kind of work. And I'm really glad that you're all here to do this. Now, there's a better than average chance that most, if not all of you, have had some kind of experience with an observance of Martin Luther King Jr. stuff, right? That at some point in your life, maybe in class or watching television or online, you've had that sort of observance moment. So you know the drill. What we do on Martin Luther King Jr. Day is we come together and we commemorate. We think about history and the past, and we celebrate. In the business of rhetorical studies, we call this epidixis, or display. It is a fundamentally conservative endeavor. When you get together to celebrate, you don't talk politics. You don't critique. You don't criticize. After your drunk uncle at Thanksgiving, you know that at a party like that, you're not supposed to create political drama. That makes tonight kind of a difficult night. Because how do you commemorate and celebrate someone who, if you take seriously, was all about creating drama? How do you come together decorously to celebrate someone who was all about violating expectations, who was fundamentally undecorous? MLK didn't play nice. So there's an inherent challenge for us when we come together to celebrate in this context. There's plenty more chairs back there. There's open space towards the front, too. If you guys want to move forward and fill in, that's good. And then there's laps. There's always a lap off. Spread the love. Luckily tonight, we're blessed with being in the presence of a scholar who can help us rise to the challenge of celebrating someone who probably wouldn't want us to celebrate. Of commemorating someone who wouldn't want us to commemorate. We're lucky to have in our presence tonight someone who can help us raise the challenge of this evening, and that's Professor Lisa Flores. Professor Lisa Flores received her undergraduate degree from Berry College and her master's degree from Northern Illinois University. She went on to earn a doctorate from the University of Georgia in 1994. She served on the faculty at DePaul University, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Arizona State University, and the University of Utah. She's currently Associate Professor of Communication at the University of Colorado. In 2004, she was awarded the Carl Wallace Memorial Award, which probably means nothing to you, but it means a great deal to those of us in the communication industry. That means that you're basically the top scholar in communication studies in the country. So this is big news. In 2007, the University of Maine honored her with a visiting Libra Diversity Professorship. In the same year, she was awarded an honors professorship and declared a faculty fellow by the University of Utah. Professor Flores has written a number of journal articles, book chapters, and reviews, many of which you've read, because I've made you. She studies public discourse to understand how nationalism, gender, and race intersect, and sexuality. She's currently working on a book titled Contested Terrains, Rhetorical Visions of the National Body of U.S. Immigration Discourse. Her work demonstrates a fierce commitment to social justice, tremendous imagination, and tremendous industry. We're faced with quite a challenge here tonight, as I've tried to suggest, but we're in good hands. So please, let us welcome Professor Lisa Flores.
Thank you all. Thank you, Eric, for that very generous, maybe a little bit inflated introduction. I am pretty honored to look out and see all of you here because probably not what you'd want to be doing necessarily, or maybe it is. And so I want to say thank you all for coming tonight. And I want to thank Eric and Brandon and Mary and all the folks who put this visit together. It's been pretty fun so far. I arrived yesterday, and it's been a very cool experience to spend this time on your campus, both your camp vibe. I don't know how you say that, but I'm not, it's not loud enough. Oh, that's probably better. Okay. Hopefully you heard enough. Do you want me to start that whole thing over? That was basically, it was thank you. But honestly, the University of Colorado Boulder has about 35,000 students. I did my undergraduate degree at a school of about 15,000, so it's kind of really cool to come back to a place where there is such cool community and to meet great people. And so again, thank you all for indulging me here tonight to talk about the stuff that is going to sound weird, but I love talking about this stuff, not because it's happy stuff, but it rejuvenates me when you all come and participate. So thank you in advance. All right, probably a little better. So today is January 20th, 2014, and today marks the 38th official federal celebration of the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who is perhaps the preeminent U.S. spokesperson for nonviolent activism and social justice. The day was signed into law by President Ronald Reagan in 1983, and it was first officially recognized in 1986. This celebration that we share in today has a long and contested history. The campaign to declare the federal holiday began soon after Dr. King's assassination in 1968, but it took until the year 2000 before all states officially recognized the holiday. And it took a petition with over 6 million signatures before Congress would pass a law naming Martin Luther King Day as an American federal holiday. The battles over its celebration, the continued resistance of some institutions to observe this day of recognition gives us indication of its significance, because Dr. King asked us as citizens to think about our shared humanity and what it might mean for us as a nation and as a people to live and work together equally and with dignity and with freedom. Tonight we come here to remember his words, but more to find inspiration and direction in his words. Across the country today, all this week, as we have done for the past 38 years, hundreds of thousands of people are commemorating the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a legacy of civil disobedience and nonviolent protest against injustice. It's a legacy grounded in the highest ideals for human dignity, a legacy grounded in freedom, in equality, in access, and in solidarity. He's widely recognized for his fights against racism and racial segregation. He also fought against poverty and discrimination more broadly. His efforts, combined with those of so many others, helped to bring to an end legal racial segregation in schools, on buses, in restaurants, and in public places more broadly. He also worked with labor unions to protest capitalist exploitation of workers and to fight for a fair minimum wage for all workers. Together, Dr. King, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and many, many others came together to work against social injustice, and in doing so, they brought about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which helped to bring to an end Jim Crow laws and to make it unlawful to discriminate on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. They also helped to bring about the National Voting Rights Act of 1965, which helped to end the rampant disenfranchisement of voters, mostly poor and non-white. Sometimes I have to stop and I have to think about that. 1965, that's the year that I was born. And in that year, poor and non-white citizens could not take for granted the right to vote. One of the most fundamental rights of citizenship was still being withheld based on race and class in 1965. Now, you might look at me and disagree, but I like to think that I'm not very old, and yet in my lifetime, poor and non-white citizens were being kept from voting. So today, in 2014, when I'm tempted to take for granted voting rights or desegregation or access, I have to stop. Because in the everyday world in which Dr. King worked, voting rights and access were not things that you took for granted. Instead, this was the world in which separate was declared equal, even though it very clearly was not equal. It was a world in which some folks had access and others were deliberately and persistently excluded. It was a world in which white supremacists could publicly be declared and applauded, and in which blacks were regularly terrorized and brutally victimized. It's not a world that I can envision or remember. And I think that it's probably, for many of you, not a world that you can envision or remember. So if you cannot today imagine that world of deliberate racialized segregation, then we know that part of what we're supposed to do here tonight, is stop and give thanks to Dr. King and the many other activists who fought and risked so that today I can't even imagine legal segregation. I'd like us to engage in a collective thank you to Dr. King and all of the civil rights activists who marched and protested and worked together relentlessly and in solidarity. And literally, I want us to say, thank you. Thank you. And now I want to argue that even though they signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, which makes discrimination no longer legal, it's still an everyday fact. But not only do I want to say thank you, but I also want today to argue that we continue to live in a racially and class-based segregated society in which some people have access and others don't. Over the last few years, there's been a lot of conversation suggesting that the United States has entered into what we call a post-racial era. The post-racial argument probably peaked in 2004 with the initial election of President Obama, but it had been around before that, and it's still around today. And we see a lot of snippets of it in media headlines, right? We see snippets like these kinds of headlines. A new post-racial political era in America. Does Barack Obama's victory herald a post-racial America? Can't we all just get post-racial? And just this month, in referencing the BCS playoffs, a post-racial era for college quarterbacks, enter meritocracy. There's even been arguments that there's a new face to America that is a blended person, the ideal multiracial beauty. These post-racial arguments have been used to argue that as a nation, we've moved beyond race and racism, that we now live in a racially equal society such that racism is no longer a societal issue or concern. Matthew Bird, undergraduate history and English major at the University of Iowa, has his explanation of post-racialism, and I think it's quite appropriate. And he says, post-racialism is essentially the idea that racism used to exist in the United States, but some people marched, and some laws got passed, and abracadabra, racism went the dodo way. Nice idea. Not very realistic. Actually, it's dangerous. In part because post-racialism and colorblind arguments allow us to blame individuals and communities of color while we ignore the blatant and rampant structural problems. Matthew Bird continues to call it staggeringly naive, and he continues by saying it propagates the idea of the death of racism in the midst of such things as the birther movement, the higher per capita poverty rate of minorities as opposed to whites, the education gap between whites and minorities, the continuing pay gap between whites and minorities, higher levels of incarceration, among hundreds of other examples. Post-racial arguments also allow us, or even encourage, almost compel us to take a blind eye and become complicit, to breathe in what race scholar Beverly Daniels Tatum calls the smog of racism and racial thinking. She writes that racism is like smog. More specifically, she says, sometimes it's so thick that it is visible, but other times it is less apparent. But always, day in and day out, we are breathing it. Her argument, her metaphor about the smog of racism, helps us understand that what might seem like a real difference between past and present, between segregation and the 38th annual commemoration of the life work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is maybe not so different. Because certainly we don't see the racism of separate but equal today. I cannot imagine walking by a sign that says for whites only. I cannot envision social structures that do not allow for some people based on the color of their skin to be invited in or excluded. I hear from my students sometimes that there are still some places that have racial codes for membership, some very elite private clubs, but those overt restrictions are not a part of my daily life. Instead, I do see a lot of visible evidence that suggests maybe racial equality, right? For instance, at my children's school, which is a small Montessori preschool and kindergarten, has only 5 total classrooms and 16 total teachers in the very homogeneous white suburb in which I live. Out of those 16 total teachers, 5 are women of color. 1/3 of the teaching staff, right? 1 of the 3 administrators is a woman of color, and that's pretty cool. We have our President, Barack Obama, elected twice. We now have a black man and a Latina as our Supreme Court justices. During his tenure, President Obama has appointed several white women and people of color to federal courts across the country. And even when young Trayvon Martin was killed, people protested everywhere, deliberately challenging the overt racist stereotype that linked black male youth with criminality and violence. These images of youth, black, white, Latino, and Asian, of families, even high-profile figures in sports teams, donning hoodies in protest, that was pretty inspiring, pretty powerful. And social media today allows us to see more and more instances of people protesting social injustice. We also sometimes think we see evidence of social change when we look to our mass media. High-profile shows like Scandal, Grey's Anatomy, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., Castle, Chicago Fire, Dracula, lots and lots of others have main characters, or regular characters at least, who are people of color. Orange is the New Black deals with sexuality and transgender issues. And even prominent public figures like Chaz Bono can make it easy to talk about things like transgender politics. Just last spring in Colorado, which is where I live, an elementary school made national news because a young transgender girl, biologically male, was barred from using the school's public restrooms, and she was asked to use the staff restrooms. Her family protested. The coverage of the controversy showed such delicacy, such humanity in talking about this little girl, right? That is new in my life. Of course, music, right? Music is filled with highly successful Black and Latino artists. Beyonce, Kanye West, Shakira, you guys can fill this list in way better than I can. Oprah Winfrey, billionaire, Black woman. So clearly celebrities of color have access, right? Then why would I stand up here tonight and say we live in a socially stratified and unjust country? Why would I claim that racism, classism, sexism, and homophobia continue to persist? How can I and so many scholars from so many disciplines, folks like Michelle Alexander, Tim Wise, Melissa Harris Perry, Henry David Thoreau, and a long, long list of others say that post-racism is an argument to dismiss? Moreover, it's an argument to make us angry and anxious. Anxious because post-racial arguments are widespread, increasingly so, and with them come appeals to color blindness. Why would I ask all this? In the midst of the seemingly visible evidence? Because I return to Beverly Daniel Tatum's, who says that, like smog, sometimes racism is harder to see. Sometimes it's invisible, but it is still there. And as difficult as racism may be to see, it still pollutes our minds in the exact same way that smog affects our lungs. When I first read this argument, I was instantly moved because this made sense to me, right? The smog metaphor helped me to conceptualize racism. But then I was thinking about coming here and talking with you, and so I decided to learn like this much more about smog, right? Like, don't ask me any questions about smog, please. But here's what I learned. These are the kinds of impacts of smog. It has different kinds of health risks. It might cause a little irritation. Maybe you'll cough a little bit. If you have some medical conditions like asthma, being exposed to smog can trigger your asthma. Over time, it can damage the lining of your lungs. Smog affects different people differently, so that children and the elderly are more susceptible. But though some of us might be at less risk, we all need to protect ourselves, and so we should stay away from smog-filled polluted air, right? It doesn't just affect us as individuals, but it can have national and even global impact, right? So recent research shows that smog is the #2 contributor to global warming, second only to carbon dioxide. So I don't really want to overextend her metaphor, but it sounds to me a lot like the dangers and consequences of racism. Invisible, maybe, sometimes a minor irritation, but it adds up in ways that have national and global implications. And it affects us differently. Some of us are more susceptible than others. But if I follow Beverly Daniels Tatum on this, we are all exposed. Maybe not all the time, but a lot of the time, right? Okay, so far I've given you some historic examples of pretty explicit racism. I've also conceded that today it's not always so visible. But I'm still going to ask you to see it despite the seemingly visible evidence by those who say we've moved past it, like the evidence of the media industry, which would suggest that people of color have access. So why am I going to talk to you about media or music? Like Eric, I'm a rhetorician, right? Fundamentally, I see public communication, rhetoric, as one of the primary building blocks of culture. In our public conversations, and for me, public conversations are television, newspaper, music, film. Those are the places where we come together as mass communities almost to talk together, almost to discuss social issues, right? Even though we're clicking onto our own television, when we watch the same thing, it's like we're having a conversation. When we read the same or similar news stories, when we watch the same or similar entertainment media, when we listen to the same or similar music, it's as if we're talking together as a society. Barry Brummett, rhetorical scholar, says culture is experienced through texts, things like news stories, television shows, advertising campaigns, and popular music. And it is in our interaction with those texts that we develop shared vocabularies. And when we have shared vocabularies, we tend to then to have shared understandings of and experiences of the world. Okay, so one of the primary theoretical arguments of rhetorical scholars, at least for me, is that as a society, we come together, understand, and experience the world through narratives, through stories. Very specific stories, like the story I might tell you about the very nice woman I sat next to on the plane on my flight out here, or much bigger, broader stories like rags to riches stories or love and romance, happily ever after stories. Rhetorical scholar Kenneth Burke said that stories and narratives provide what he calls equipment for living. That is, we tell stories about the world and people within the world as a means of helping us to navigate the world. And we do this with young children all the time, right? We read, Elmo goes to the doctor, right? We read, Spot goes to school. And we use these stories to help little children know what to expect at the doctor or on the first day of school, but also to help shape their experiences of the doctor in the first day of school, all right? So if we tell stories all the time about teachers as helpful, then maybe they experience teachers as helpful. If we tell stories all the time about black men as violent or frightening, then maybe we actually come to experience black men as violent or frightening, right? The next really crucial piece of this comes together, particularly as we think about race and racism, if we bring Burke's argument about stories as equipment for living into conversation with the work of media scholar George Gerbner. Gerbner also draws attention to cultural narratives, and he concludes that the ultimate shaping of human behavior is the stories we hear. He continues to say that in mass media, we tell the same basic stories over and over again. These are stories of good and bad, danger and safety, love and romance. Gerbner argues more specifically that stories cultivate or encourage to grow sets of ideas and perspectives that come to shape how we live and how we act in the world. For me, one of his most powerful examples comes when he talks about stories of violence on television. Everything from scenes of subway shootings to street crimes to stranger danger. He says he's arguing against what he calls the monkey see, monkey do perspective, right? The monkey see, monkey do. If I consume a lot of stories about violence, then I become more violent. And he says, no, that's not what happens. I don't become more violent, I become more afraid. I think I'm going to be a victim, right? And this, again, makes so much sense to me because I remember in my body, like my body still feels my childhood fears about stranger danger. I remember being absolutely terrified in my home, at school, even at church on my way to communion, that someone was going to grab me, right? Today, I know the statistics that most violence, whether it's violence to children or violence to adults, violence to men or violence to women, is not from strangers, but from people we know. I know that statistically, very few women are attacked by random men as they walk along a dark street, but still, I am afraid, right? Gerbner points out that the power of stories of violence is so great that at one point the city of New York banned any television scenes that showed shootings in New York subways, because every time a show did that, people stopped riding the subway. Stories of violence cultivate for us the sense that we live in a world surrounded by danger, and then we act as if it's true. All right, so how is all of this relevant to media representation? How is this relevant for us as we think about media representation and race? In media, we tell two crucial stories about race. One of these is the sort of Cosby Show legacy. It's a story of access and success for people of color. In the Cosby Show legacy, blacks and Latinos on TV and film are judges, they're doctors, they're lawyers, they're highly successful, they're middle class, they're upper class, everything is fine. We as a society don't need to do anything, we don't need to worry, we certainly don't need laws or policies to remedy. Media scholar Herman Gray argues that the Cosby Show legacy functions as a type of what he calls representational equity. That is, it looks like everything is okay. It represents the world as equitable. Media tells us again and again that we have indeed arrived at a post-racial moment where people of color have access to good jobs, to good education, to safety. The second major story that's cultivated in media is the racial pathology story, where blacks and Latinos are criminals, drug dealers, welfare queens. We are lazy and useless, we are a drain on social services. This story encourages society to blame people of color for their problems. And it tells us again and again and again that black and Latino men are violent. Whether it's in news reports or on Law and Order, black and Latino men are routinely depicted in almost brutally violent ways. And when we see them again and again, we act as if they are. Now, in contrast to these repeated stories of racial violence, we rarely see complex contemporary accounts of racism or sexism or heterosexism. Media almost never exposes the smog of contemporary racism. Instead, it participates in maintaining the invisibility of racism. If Gerbner is correct when he says that the stories we tell and share shape the culture, the laws, and the policies we live in, then we have to pay attention to the ways in which our understandings of and perspectives on the world and on race are shaped by mediated stories which mask its complexities. Media gives us very little to help us think about racial politics. Instead, in this very increasingly digitized world, we might even be returning to a time, we are returning to a time in which violently hateful and explicit racist comments abound. Maybe not always, maybe not in the classroom, maybe not in the gym, but they're there in our social media, right? Did you see the allegedly controversial Cheerios ad that sparked so much hate that Cheerios had to disable the comment section on YouTube? So this was in 2013. What was so controversial in the year 2013, 46 years after the Supreme Court ruling in Loving versus Virginia, 1967, ended laws that prohibited interracial marriage? Cheerios decided to show an interracial family. That's it. A white mom, black dad, super cute biracial kid eating Cheerios. So hateful, so ugly, and so many that they had to disable the comments section. Maybe you heard about the comments that flew when 10-year-old Sebastian de la Cruz, mariachi singer, semi-finalist on America's Got Talent, and San Antonio native, San Antonio, Texas, within the US native, sang the national anthem during games 3 and 4 of the NBA Finals between the San Antonio Spurs and the Miami Heat. This amazing performance.
El Charro de Oro de la Cruz.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming?
This performance sparked these comments. Why is a foreigner singing the national anthem? I realize that's San Antonio, but that still ain't Mexico. Who let this illegal alien sing our national anthem? Why they got a Mexican kid singing the national anthem? All right, so maybe you want to say, sure, social media, a space that invites extremists. How about Wisconsin political aid? Tweeting, I will choke the illegal Mex cleaning the library. Did get fired. Or Iowa Representative Steve King, who repeatedly in his public speeches demonizes undocumented youth, those who want to go to college, basically equating them with drug dealers. For everyone who's a valedictorian, there's another 100 out there hauling 75 pounds of marijuana across the desert. You have no doubt seen the racist attacks on President Obama that range from claiming that he's a terrorist to denying his citizenship to proclaiming that he plays the race card if he even thinks about mentioning the word race. So maybe you're saying, yes, that happens, but it's rare. Maybe you're thinking most of us are not like that. We don't post racist comments on YouTube Cheerios commercials. We don't demonize entire populations of people. And we don't think that President Obama is a dangerous socialist who was more like Hitler than like us. And that is indeed what they say about President Obama. And I agree. Most of us are nice people who believe in the fundamental humanity of others and who oppose these very narrow and hateful ways of thinking and acting in the world. Most of us do not commit what race scholars call individual acts of overt racism or injustice. We do not say the N-word. We do not beat up men because they look too feminine. And we did, after all, elect President Obama twice to the highest office in the country. But still today, as we celebrate Dr. King's birth, his work, and his life, there is work that we have to do, right? Dr. King reminds us, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. All right, so I'm going to push a little bit further, and I'm going to take you to some rampant abuses, some inequities, some structural and institutional racism. Because the smog of racism that Beverly Daniel Tatum talks about is produced by institutional and structural racism, both of which are invisible, and yet both make it almost impossible for us to come anywhere close to a just and equitable society. Because unlike individual acts of racism, such as hateful posts that are clearly intentional, institutional racism is racism by habit, racial practices that have become discriminatory, and the way we do it. These are the kinds of institutional policies and practices that do not necessarily overtly distinguish by race, but have clear racial implications. Things like ACT tests, or photo identification laws and rules. Some banks, for instance, will not let you open a checking account without 2 forms of government-issued photo identification. In the past 2 years, 41 states have introduced some kind of restrictive voting legislation, mostly requiring particular forms of photo identification. Now, maybe that seems reasonable, except that the people most likely to not have such particular forms of identification are people of color, they are elderly, and they are students. So regardless of intent, right, regardless of whether these laws are designed to be racist, these laws disenfranchise entire populations, mostly around race, class, and age. And remember that one of the pieces of legislation that we commemorate today is the Voting Rights Act, which tried to remove the policies and the cultural practices that serve to disenfranchise entire communities. The Voting Rights Act was a major accomplishment because it gave all people access to voting, right? Voting is where we make our laws, the kinds that maybe don't discriminate. So if people of color can't vote, then they can't change the legal practices that discriminate. And if poor people can't vote, then they can't elect people who represent their interests as the working poor, right? Institutional and structural racism are the roots of individual racism and of larger social inequities. Institutional and structural racism produce the structures that make equity impossible, right? Just recently, the United States experienced a housing crisis. The figures on it vary a little bit, depending on where you look, but they're mostly pretty staggering, right? May 2013 NBC News report says 5 million families had lost their homes and predicted another 3 million to come. RealtyTrack is a site that tracks real estate transactions, and it found evidence of 4 million completed foreclosures between 2007 and 2011, with an additional 8.2 in process. If you compare the total numbers of people who lost their homes, 56% of those who lost their homes were white families, and 44 were families of color, mostly Black and Latino. If you look at foreclosures based on the percentage of the populations who own homes, overwhelmingly the foreclosure crisis hit on poor, lower income, and Black and Latino populations. You can look at all the different statistics, and there are a lot, and there's different conclusions. They're all slightly different, but the final conclusion across them is mostly consistent, and that is, as said by responsiblelending.org, the foreclosure crisis will be particularly devastating to African American and Latino families. Now, why is that? Well, in large part, it's because African American and Latinos were 30% more likely than others to be directed to what were called high-cost subprime loans, right? This 30% more likely takes into account income and credit. So Black and Latino borrowers with similar income, similar assets, and similar credit were 30% more likely than other borrowers to be sold the kind of loans that went into foreclosures. Right? On its own, the foreclosure crisis was crippling. For Black and Latino families, it complicated a long history of wealth disparity tied to home ownership. So what I'm going to do right here, what I'm trying to do is illustrate for you the ways in which racism, structural and institutional, comes to perpetuate these crippling injustices. So I'm going to give you a long example. And in this example, what I'm arguing is that the unjust practices of home ownership are linked today and historically to race and to wealth. I'm going to argue that the race-wealth gap creates the smog of racism that produces the stories, the racist narratives of meritocracy that say some of us are here because we belong, we worked hard, and others because we got here by scholarship, because we're affirmative action votes, that some of us are to blame for our failures, all right? So here's the fact. In the United States, race and wealth are connected. Today and historically, the United States is structured to produce and reproduce a racial wealth gap. That wealth gap is linked to home ownership. Both historically and today, whites have been more likely than people of color to own their own homes. The gap in home ownership today is the same as it was 40 years ago. And this is important for a couple of reasons. Historically in the United States, home ownership has been linked to family wealth, right? I don't mean income, and I don't mean being wealthy. I don't mean Kardashian wealthy. I mean wealth. Wealth is what you own minus what you owe, right? It's not the same as income. Income is what you earn, which you use to pay for your necessities, your gas, your groceries, your mortgage, right? Wealth is what you own, your assets, like your stocks, your savings account, your real estate, your businesses, minus your debt, right? Family wealth, greater ownership than owingship, means a lot. It means better ability to move, it means greater ability to move to better neighborhoods, which tend to have better schools. Greater ability to pay college tuition, to save for retirement, to have a measure of security in times of high unemployment and economic unrest. It means better credit, which means lower interest rates. It means more travel, more museum memberships, more dance classes and scout camping trips and swimming lessons. It means greater ability to leave some kind of inheritance to your children, thus helping them to have greater wealth. Wealth is one of the primary ways in which we transfer inequality from one generation to the next. When race and wealth are connected, as they are in the United States, systemic racial inequality is inherited, right? Get that. Systemic racial inequality is inherited. In 2012, law professor Dorothy Brown found that the racial wealth gap has hit an all-time high, right? Blue is net worth held by whites, right? Black, Hispanic, and other down at the bottom. The largest gap in 2012 since the government began collecting this data. The Institute on Assets and Social Policy tries to explain that by saying the biggest factor in the growing racial wealth gap is home ownership. Research also suggests that if we have equal gains on both sides, such as equal gains in income, those do not produce equal gains in wealth, right? So what that means is there's a racial wage gap where Black and Latinos earn less than whites. Even if we have equal increases on both sides, or on all three sides, Black and Latino wealth will not increase at pace with white wealth, right? Why not? Well, you've probably played, or at least you know about the game Monopoly. Everyone starts off in the game equal. You get $2,000. You have the same opportunity to go around the board. When you go around the board, you buy property. Then you pass go, you get $200. You buy some more properties. You pass go, you get $200. You get some houses, you get some hotels, you get some rent. You get some more rent, you get some more rent. Maybe you go around the board, you pay a little rent. Am I having a problem here? Did we go here? Okay, I just had a minor problem. You go around the board, you pay a little rent, maybe a little bit of both, right? The game lasts a really long time. So what happens if you join the game late, right? You start off, oh, that's what happened, I went too fast. That's right, I can fix it. If you join the game late, you still start off with the exact same resources that everyone else had. You still get $2,000. You land on the exact same squares. You play by the same rules, the same game rules, the same policy that say, go around the board, buy properties, go around the board, pass go, get $200, go around the board, except that most of the properties already been bought. So every time you land on a piece of property, you don't increase what you own, you increase what you owe. In Monopoly, property ownership is the foundation of wealth. But in the United States as well, property ownership is the foundation of wealth, such that Professor Shapiro says, where am I? There it is. Home wealth accounts for 60% of the total wealth among America's middle class. It has been, and it continues to be, even in today's unstable housing market, one of the primary ways in which families accumulate wealth. Think about it. What asset do most families have that is greater than their home? If you're middle or lower income, probably your home is the greatest asset you have. And in the United States, both today and historically, race and home ownership have been linked. How? Today, Black and Latino borrowers have a 60% higher rejection rate when applying for home mortgages compared to whites, even when they're equally credit worthy. When approved, Blacks and Latinos are given higher interest rates than whites. In part, it's because whites bring a greater down payment. But why do whites bring a greater down payment? One study found that 1/2 of white homeowners relied on financial assistance from their families, a loan or a gift. Only 1/8 of African Americans had financial help from their families, right? Wealth is inherited. If your parents have it, they can give it to you, but if they don't have it, then they can't give it to you, right? So when you go back to Monopoly, we see how the wealth disparity is partly about who joined the home ownership game first. But remember the board, right? It's also about who bought what properties, because the board is basically segregated, right? Lower income properties at the very beginning, Park Place and Broadway at the end. You have to have enough to get all the way to Park Place and Broadway before you can even buy the better properties. It's a segregated board. It was actually designed that way, right? It was designed to show these lessons. All right, so let's figure out historically how this has happened. One of the historic moments that has defined home ownerships in racial terms was in the 1930s with the creation of the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA. The FHA provided home loans. Before the creation of the FHA, you had to put down 50% of the purchase price and you were given a few years to pay off your home. Now that meant that home ownership was an incredibly limited thing. Only the most elite. People had to have wealth and income to buy a home. But the FHA did two different things. They created loans that allowed you to put down 10 or 20%, and they gave you a loan term that was much longer, up to 30 years to pay off your loan. That changed home ownership. It made it possible for a lot more people to buy homes. It also created a new industry, a housing market, because if the average person can now buy a home, then we need to have a whole lot more homes. And in doing that, it created suburbs. But get this, the FHA also determined that race mattered, that if so-called Negroes bought homes in the suburbs, home values would suffer. So also in the 1930s, government officials developed a national appraisal system, and homes appraised based on size, on amenities, on condition, but also on location, on where and on who lived where. Communities that were all white and were located in the suburbs, far away from the very racially diverse cities, got the highest ratings. They were coded green. Those homes that were all minority or those neighborhoods were becoming racially integrated, got lower ratings and were coded red. And in this process, we developed what's been called redlining, a process in which your loan application was denied if you were not white, particularly if you were Black, and especially if you were trying to buy a home in a neighborhood with good appreciation. Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government provided $120 billion in home loans. Less than 2% of it went to non-whites. This process basically secured the property value of whiteness. Suburbs were segregated, but not by law, by cultural practice. If everything I'm telling you about wealth, inheritance, home ownership, and race is true, then what happens here is crucial. Patterns of wealth are put in place that cannot be undone. You cannot enter monopoly an hour late and win. You can't even remain stable, right? Once the properties are developed, that's it. It's simply not possible without a major miracle to undo that. And without wealth, and again, I'm not talking about being wealthy. I'm talking about having the kinds of assets that give you access to schools, access to lower interest rates, to books and to museums, to quality nutrition and to healthcare, to the kinds of things that should be equitably distributed but are not, to the kinds of experience that produce the kinds of knowledge and sets of skills that allow some people to successfully navigate college campuses. Wealth does this. And wealth has been racially contained in ways that create our understandings and experiences of race and of worth. It has filled our skies and our lungs with so much smog that it has become normal to participate in racial narratives of superiority and inferiority, of deserving and undeserving. Now let me take you to one last piece of this larger equation, right? I've said race and wealth are connected through institutional and structural practices around home ownership. I've said that redlining and home ownership linked property and created whiteness. In part, redlining created new systems of whiteness through inclusion and exclusion, such that whiteness and property were in practice connected. And whiteness and property then became in ideology also connected. Cheryl Harris makes the argument that whiteness is property. Harris is a law professor, and in 1993 she wrote an essay titled Whiteness as Property. In this essay, she tries to account for the cultural and social investments that we as a racially stratified nation have in race, and more specifically in whiteness. She's arguing that being white has a value as great as that which we afford to property, right? So in the United States, property is something that you have, and you hold it, and you pass on to your children as their inheritance, because that property is so valuable that it gives your children, and your children's children, and your children's children's children worth and advantage, right? Whiteness, like property, is something that you have, and you hold on to, and you pass on as inheritance, because it is so valued that it gives your children, and your children's children, and your children's children's children worth and advantage, right? So she was a legal scholar. Harris wanted to know, does this logic around whiteness play out in law and policy? And she found indeed that it does. That the very legal definitions of black and white structured whiteness as the opposite of blackness in ways that functioned like a property line, a fence that you might put on your property that says private property, no trespassers allowed. And it did this through what we call hypodescent, or more commonly the one-drop rules, that say if a person has even one drop of African ancestry, he or she is black. These were first adopted in Tennessee around 1910. But prior to 1910, hypodescent laws, one-drop rules, had been proposed in some different forms as far back as the 1850s. But they were protested mostly by whites. Because, of course, there were a lot of mixed-race people, many of whom looked white and thus were accepted as white and could live as white. And they protested the laws because they knew that they needed to protect their property investment in whiteness. They knew the status change that would happen should one-drop laws be passed, so they protest. There are different explanations for why one-drop law rules came to be passed when they did, but most scholars say that post-emancipation, as blacks gained social and political mobility, one-drop rules became a way to contain them again. The laws made it easier to segregate and to exclude, and thus to retain the property value of whiteness. Indeed, through one-drop rules, the exclusiveness of the property value of whiteness increased. Hypodescent laws help us understand the ways in which whiteness has social value, property value, and the means through which that property value is protected. Because if you think about it, when we have something of value that we want to protect, we take measures to protect it. We install fences and we install security systems. We keep undesirable people out. And the more that we fear that our property is at risk, the more vigilantly we protect it. And in many ways, this is how race operates in the United States. Whiteness is protected by law, by cultural practice, and by ideological systems that all work together to ensure its exclusiveness and its inheritability. All right, so think about this question. This question is asked by historian and race scholar Matthew Fry Jacobson, and he is trying to figure out how can something so arbitrary seem so rigid and vice versa. And he asks, why is it that in the United States, a white woman can have black children, but a black woman cannot have white children? And he basically goes on to say, isn't that biologically nonsensical? But culturally, stop it. And legally, it continues to be the narrative we tell in order to protect the property value of whiteness. Still today, a black woman cannot have white children, right? Barack Obama has been named repeatedly as the nation's first black president. He's been championed as the mark of our national accomplishment, to move beyond race. He's been called a racist and a socialist. He's even been identified as mixed race. But he is almost never named America's 44th white president. Tiger Woods is black to mixed race, but never, ever white, right? Even today, black bodies do not produce white bodies. And it is in these ways that the institutional and structural racism, such as lending practices, produces the smog of racism in which some bodies matter more than other bodies, in which we continue to live in a nation where we are judged by the color of our skin and not by the content of our character. So what are we supposed to do with all of this, right? King once asked, life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? And it is a question that deserves our attention tonight. Sometimes the weight of this feels so great, right? Even to me when I do this every day, because most of us here are not in a position to deny or grant home loans. We can feel like single individuals, small and not very useful. But that's because we forget that small change too matters, right? So again, I turn to Beverly Daniels Tatum. She gives me two more metaphors that I find really powerful. The first is the metaphor of the moving sidewalk. You know, at the airport, the moving sidewalk. She argues that there is active racism. Active racism is like moving quickly on that moving sidewalk. It's the kind that is actively participating in hate crimes. And in that active movement is almost propelling racism forward. But there's also passive racism. And passive racism is what many race scholars call the most dangerous kind, right? Because it is when we stand still on the moving sidewalk, when we don't do anything ourselves, but we don't resist and we don't protest. We stay silent, we watch, we let it happen. It's only, she says, when we walk quickly in the opposite direction that we are working to end racism. Tatum also talks about what she calls the sphere of influence. Tatum is the president of Spelman College, the nation's oldest historically black college for women. And she talks about how she was asked to move from being a faculty member to administration and ultimately to apply for presidency. And she always wanted to refuse and stay in the classroom, but she recognized that the impact of her active walking in the opposite direction was linked to the size of her sphere of influence. She could make change in the classroom, she could make institution-wide change as president. So she's very clear that the size of our sphere of influence has an impact. We might have greater opportunities for big-scale change, but she's also very clear that when we act as individuals with small impact, that too counts, right? So we're all sitting here today. I don't know your spheres of influence, but I imagine we have bigger and smaller ones and different ones, right? But we all have spheres of influence. So as I close, I want to talk a little bit about the ways in which we might walk quickly in the opposite direction, right? We might do that just by sitting here. Maybe you'd rather be at home. I think tonight is a show called Castle, right? So maybe you'd rather be there, but you're here, right? You're here. And for me, I'm a rhetorical scholar. I'd never heard of it until like a week ago. I am absolutely convinced that the stories we tell and share create the cultures, the policies, and the practices we participate in. So if that's true, then being willing to be here and have this conversation is active walking forward, backwards. Because if we can tell a different story, then we can live a different life, right? And I absolutely believe that. So one example. In 2013, the Supreme Court struck down aspects of the Defense of Marriage Act, such that the federal government now officially recognizes all valid gay and lesbian marriages, right? Regardless of what you think about civil unions and the Defense of Marriage Act, what happened in 2013 was federal policy change that prior to that, even 5 years ago for many people was unthinkable, unimaginable, right? The unimaginable becomes doable when we imagine it. It really does, right? So how do we imagine differently? How do we, as individuals, as community members, educators, students, faculty, staff, administration, imagine? Well, what if, when the opportunity arises to have a conversation, we show up and we participate, right? We show up like you did here. Sometimes it's hard to show up because racism is often invisible. But what if, when somebody in class, somebody at the gym, somebody at home says, that's so gay, you say, dude, so not cool, right? Or on your Facebook feed, when you get that anti-immigrant video, you respond vocally, you name yourself and you say, this is wrong, you are wrong. What if there was a designated space on campus, a cluster of chairs that everybody came to know as the place you went when you wanted or needed to talk about this stuff? And you knew that as soon as you sat down, you could count that somebody else was going to come sit there with you, be visibly sitting there in the social justice chairs as your ally, as your friend, just to talk with, right, as your strategist. What if students created social media campaigns. Hashtag CSBSJU silences compliance, right? And you started the feed. Hashtag Johnny's and Benny's Equity Now. Hashtag solidarity and diversity. Right? Social media is amazing. It's not just a side of hate, but it's also a side of change, right? Did you see the parody of the Cheerios ad? It's brilliant, right? What if students circulated a petition? Again, technology allows us to do this for a social justice minor. And that would tell your faculty, your staff, your administration that you want more opportunities to have these conversations, and you want them to create the courses and find the funding. What if faculty and staff said, yes, let's do that, and they told the administration that they needed professional development in order to be able to do that, so that they could better do this with you and for you? What if everybody here stands up and says, and offers a what if, and then somebody else says, I'm going to do that with you. I will help you do that. What if everybody, regardless of how you're here, student, faculty, staff, administrator, signed a petition to upper administration that said, recognize the national holiday? What if every time we had the opportunity, we showed up as allies and we made visible the smog, right? Because when we all show up, we live a different world. It will not be easy, it will not be fast, right? It will require a lot of us, and it will require a lot from us. But the more it requires, the more we have to show up, right? And remember the words of Dr. King. And he says, if you can't fly, then run, but if you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl, but whatever you do, you have to keep moving forward. Thank you.
You said that like housing or like houses are one of the biggest signs of wealth that it could be passed down, I guess. So what would you think would be like an effective foreign policy to make it a fair system for everyone?
So if I understand your question, like how do we disrupt the structural racial wealth gap, right? Well, we need, all right. Here, we got to make it visible, number one, right? People need to know that banking practices continue to perpetuate these kinds of practices. We need to make that visible. And we need social protest against it, because unless we have that kind of stuff broken up, then we can't create the spaces in which you all, as young people, are going to be able to gain the kinds of access to wealth that disrupt it. Now, there's a lot of folks who would argue pretty radical stuff and would say, we need to redistribute this stuff, right? And they do this redistribution in different kinds of ways. So here's maybe a different way we can do it. And I'm gonna give you a personal example that's a little bit, it's some of my shame, right? So I moved a few years ago to a predominantly white suburb that has good schools, all right? And then last November, amendment to referendum, something was put forward that was going to redistribute the tax money, the money in my county, so that public schools had equitable funding, right? Now, this person was like, Mommy? Was like, whoa, 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 those are my kids. That's my kids' school you're taking money from, right? So I have to vote for that. I have to vote for it. I have to say, schools should be equally funded, because if schools are equally funded, then you have more equitable access to the education, and when you have more equitable access, then you show up here, right? And it's slow change, right? It's not instant, but we have to, those of us with a little bit more have to be willing to redistribute it, right? And you gotta say, stop. You've gotta make us, right? That's a hard question.
I just want to thank you for coming. My name is Edwin, and one question for me to you is, what do you think is an answer to someone who's a bystander? So often, And even in our campus, we do see subtle forms of discrimination. How do you address those who just stand by? What answer do you have for those students who just keep going to class? Just scroll down the post on the Facebook pages. Why do you think this happens, and what solutions do you have to students who just bystand?
So in some ways, this is equally hard, but other ways it's way easier, because here it is, right? Every single one of us has this sphere of influence to say, stop, to say that is wrong, to say you don't get to say that, right? To intervene. Now, I don't want you to do anything that puts you physically at risk, right? But every day I know that I'm faced with the opportunity to show up in those ways, right? To not be a bystander. I try to do it as much as I can. I'm lying if I tell you I do it all the time, right? But because sometimes you should sometimes pick and choose, but it is the one thing we can do, right? And you cluster yourselves. I was talking to faculty earlier about this, right? You cluster yourselves in courses, in everywhere on campus that you can be, with like-minded folks, not so that you don't think other things, but so that when you need to bystand, you've got somebody with you, right? Because being an ally is one of the things that we can do. I think there's bystander training coming up. I think it's maybe about this later this week, right? You ask your faculty, and maybe you all do safe zone training, right? So you ask your faculty to participate in safe zone training and post their flyers so that you know where you go, right? But you all identify each other, and you find some kind of code that you can give to each other, right? Some kind of, like, I don't know, something that you do. And so when you see each other, you know it's okay, right? Somebody's got my back here, right? And so you ally, and you do it, right?
First off, thank you for speaking. And my question is, for all these social changes that you say that needs to happen at this time of age, would you say it needs to there needs to be changes within, I guess, the high positions, and change out the individuals who hold that, who implement these changes in this type of culture, or is it something that the people still needs to fight for?
It's a really good question. We want it at the highest levels, right? Because we want the laws, the policies, because those did make a difference, but they fix some, but we can only legislate so much stuff, right? We can't legislate the ways in which we act. And so here's where I think queer politics are so instructive. Again, because 10 years ago, Pride days were smaller, and bodies were not, there were not so visibly queer bodies. And I'm not talking about who sleeps with whom, but I'm talking about bodies that disrupt the norms, right? The bodies where we just have to stop and say, right? And when queer bodies populate, that's something that we can do, change the ways in which we individually live and act in the world. When we do those in ways that disrupt, that question, that make abnormal, the more of us who do it, the more it becomes. And then for all of its problematicness, aspects of the Defense of Marriage Act are undone, right? So we create the new narrative. We do that, right? And because they can't, nobody, right? I don't know, I'm gonna just keep saying that over and over again. It doesn't mean we don't need the other stuff, but we can't wait for the other stuff, right? I guess I believe that when we do it, the other stuff comes as well, right?
This is really loud. Thinking about the Cheerios commercial and then also the hashtags that you put up there, do you think that social media is more helpful or harmful to the public sphere in terms of race?
Man. All right, so I'm gonna, I don't have, this is hopeful me talking, right? I think that most of us do not post hateful stuff, right? But most of us do participate in social media, which means that most of us could do it differently. And just a Twitter feed, right? Refusing to bystand the ugliness on your Facebook feed, right? I think there are more of us who would be willing to do that than to do the other thing. I believe that. And so therefore it can be, it should be. And I think it is actually, right? The next time you're home, not right now, but the next time you're home, Google Walmart workers flash mob, right? Walmart has been engaging in some pretty questionable practices with their workers, really sort of making workers feel at risk for their jobs, firing workers because they wanted to organize for better working conditions. And in one store in the South, community members came forward with a petition that said reinstate this worker, and the folks kind of said, well, we can't take this right now, you know, our boss is not here, we're not allowed to take this. And then like 30 workers broke out in a flash mob, right? They took off their clothes and they were wearing the same t-shirts, and they did this incredible thing right in the middle of Walmart, right? Then it got on YouTube, then it got 1 million hits, right? So I think that stuff is out there as much as.
This might be like a pretty difficult question, but I don't mean it to be difficult, but so my question is, like, I've read somewhere, I don't even remember where I read it, but like it was saying that basically, I don't even remember how it was worded, but it was saying that it's hard to deny, like, it's hard to be racist as an individual, but easy to be racist as a group. So I just feel like, I don't know, like you say like allies, like create allies, but I don't feel like it could be like that effective if we, like as the minorities, are kind of prideful in a sense, because it's hard to ask someone who is privileged to be an ally, do you know what I mean? And like even Frederick Douglass, or like you see how they strive for success, and it kind of makes you want to do it on your own. So I don't really know how, like, I don't know, how to humble yourself and ask for it, I guess. I don't know if that's a question, but.
So let's just say you're not going to have to, right? That when you step up and take the risk, somebody is going to be there as an ally for you, and you're not going to have to ask them, right? And that's not, so I'm not really suggesting that, I guess I would be suggesting that the work that each one of us would have to do is probably different, right? And it's linked to so many different variables about where we are in our lives, our experiences, our needs, our wants, our privileges, and our lacks of privileges. But I think that there is some way in which every single one of us could ally for somebody else, right? Just being willing to show up visibly sometimes in a place that other people want to look at you skeptical for being there, right? And so let me give you this one example. We have a national organization. It's called the National Communication Organization. And in 1998, so no, it must have been way later than that, probably in like early 2000s, many of us wanted new divisions around our identity politics. We wanted a Latino division, an African American division, a gay lesbian division, something else, an Asian American division, and I'm forgetting the fifth one, right? And so we went to all of our business meetings and we took petitions. And we would all stand up and give the speech that said, the spiel that said, we need these divisions, they help us get our scholarship out there, they help us, they give us more visibility, they complicate the conversation, the research gets better. Please sign these petitions. If we get enough, then we get to have this, right? I was at the Women's Caucus, which was the place where women, feminist-oriented women who were supposed to be at social change were there. And they signed all of them except the gay lesbian one, because they were afraid that they'd be thought of as lesbian, right? And we needed their allyship. We needed them to say, so you think I'm like, so what, right? I'm signing because, right? So it's that kind of allyship that in part we need, right? If you were to have the social justice sofa cluster and you sat there alone, but then people sat next to you, when they sat next to you, their visible bodies create a space in which, number one, it's okay, you talk, you resource, you connect, but you're also not left there hanging out all on your own, right? So those kinds of ways in which we can ally.
Hi, I'm Monica, and I'm an educator. And you talked about the stories that, the stories shape us and shape our, what we think about others and racial groups. And so suggestions, what stories I mean, the media is out there. The parents' viewpoint is out there. What, you know, even from, I'm a Spanish and French teacher actually. So from the Latino perspective, what kinds of, do you have suggestions? Do you have, you know, I mean, you know, you can tell the farm worker's story, but that isn't always, then you're seeing people as farm workers. I mean, you can look at a lot of stories and say, well, but then they're gonna think that all these people are coming over the board. But some of these people, you know, how do you, any suggestions for the stories?
Right. In many ways, this is sort of the bystander piece as well, because a lot of times we can do these stories just like in our everyday world, right? And so I think, I mean, given that we're on a college campus, one of the most dangerous stories on college campuses is don't get upset with me, Brandon, is the diversity and tolerance story. Because the diversity and tolerance story says, you know, we should open the doors and we should let those poor, underprivileged students of color come in. But then what happens is that they become the scholarship kids and the affirmative action kids, and we think that they don't belong. We think that, and then they become not smart enough, they didn't deserve to get in, right? So we have these narratives about affirmative action and quotas and scholarship kids. But we don't tell stories about legacies. And so then we sit in class as faculty, staff, students, and we assume some people belong and some people don't belong, right? Some people earned their way and other people got in on affirmative action. So we have to not tell that diversity and tolerance story. We have to tell a story about inclusivity and a story about excellence, a story about how there's no way we could have a real education if we didn't think complexly about all different perspectives. And that requires that we bring all race, diversity, sexuality, or all of it into the picture, because it's only there that we complicate our stories, right? So we disrupt those everyday stories. And we be very careful about, you know, like, every story can be misused, right? We can talk about the farm worker story as a way to say, farm workers do labor that no other single body is showing up to do. Farm and food is an issue of national security. And so we can tell this story without it being a story of tokenization and essentialism, but it requires that we continue to tell different kinds of stories. The more stories and the more complex the stories, the more that they challenge the really singular stories. I don't know if that helps. You look dissatisfied. No, I think so.
Hello. I don't know if you're going to have an answer for this, but I'm just wondering, as a white person, how do you go about helping when sometimes people don't think you should help? They think, oh, you are like the majority, you are privileged, and they think you helping is like a charity cause, and like I don't know if other people feel that way, but sometimes that's a stigma that gets put on white people who try and help this cause. I don't know if you have any like tips or how to kind of go about that.
So know first that you're going to screw up, right? But every single one of us is going to, right? So one of the things, and are you a student here? Okay. So one of the things that students of color tell me is that the most frustrating thing for students of color, particularly women of color in the classroom, is that they say something, and it was risky, and they were scared, and then nobody else says anything. But then after class, another colleague, usually a white woman, says, "That was so great what you said in class." And the student says, "Well, why didn't you say that in class? I needed you to say it in class," right? So that's one of the things that you can do. The other thing you do is you listen, and sometimes you say, you know, what can I do, right? Because the problem that many of us have, and it's not a problem of white bodies, but the more access to privilege we have, and we get greater access just by being here, right, in these rooms, the more we tend to think that we know what to do, right? And so then I tend to tell you what to do, but I didn't even ask you what's going on in your life that you need help doing, right? So the first thing that we have to do regardless is sort of watch and listen and see, is there something I can do, right? And respect the words that we hear in response. Sometimes the word is, you know what, I got it, right? But sometimes it is, yeah, right? And so we do that.
Hi, thank you for coming. My question is that at our school, it is majority white students here, and I just feel like around campus, there's this like, I don't know if it's the Minnesota nice or like smog racism, but the people or students feel like they can't talk about what's happening around campus or racism, so that I think that when you don't talk about it, you can't progress. And do you have any solutions to how to make students step forward to be able to feel open and talk about it in a positive or safe environment?
So the first thing that you should know is that it's not just here, right? It's most places. It is probably, a national epidemic. We are lousy at talking complexly about race, right? And so one of the things that I would say to you, it's such a hard thing to do. I'm gonna say to you as a woman who looks like you're a woman of color. How about I'll say it that way, all right? Here's what I want you to remember, right? When people don't engage, it is not necessarily malicious, right? That doesn't negate its impact at all. But it's because we're afraid, right? And we're afraid because we're gonna screw up. And when we screw up, then we get called racist, sexist, whatever, right? And we don't want that. We don't want to feel guilty, and we don't want to feel ashamed, right? So at the very least, say to yourself, probably afraid, right? Then you think to yourself, what am I afraid of, right? Like, and when I'm afraid, what do I do? One of the things that I do when I'm afraid is I don't do anything because I'm afraid, right? I don't know how to do that. I'm not going to do it. I can, spend all my life doing the stuff that I'm really good at, but I don't do the stuff I don't know how to do because I'm afraid, right? Regardless, right? But particularly around this stuff that's really contested. So at least say, we got to do it. We're going to mess up. And then you sometimes say, especially to your friends, and it's going to be okay when you mess up because I'm still going to be with you, right? Right? The world is not going to end, but we have to figure out how do we do it. And the only way to figure out how to do it, it's like riding a bike, right? You're going to fall down, and it's going to hurt. And then you got to get up, and you got to do it again, right? And then you got to do it and do it and do it and do it until you do it better. Nobody's going to do it perfect, ever. I'm sorry, I just don't think but we're going to do it better and better and better. And when you do it with respect, right? When you do it with caring, then sometimes it's okay. So to the degree to which, and I'm not trying to put the responsibility on you, right? But to the degree to which in those interactions, I'm good regardless of what gets said here, right? I'm good, right? Then you can show up and fall down, and then maybe it happens more and more and more. I think you've got to ask your administration to create more spaces for you to do this, right? Because I think you want to be able to do it in the classroom so that you feel more comfortable doing it somewhere else, right? I think you got to be able to do it in your student union. I think you've got to be able to have spaces where you can do it and feel okay, like practice spaces, right? And then you do it again, and you do it again, and you do it again, right? But you also need, the more vulnerable you feel, the more you need your safety measures to take care of you as well, right? Because nobody needs to show up all the time and have to do this all the time. It is just so hard, right? So I don't know if that helps at all.
I don't really know how to ask this question, but earlier you were talking about like freedom, and you were talking about like the fear. I was thinking that that for like North American or like America up here, there's that fear that arises from social media that's like stacked up even for now. And how do we as a minority gain the sort of freedom from what we fear? Like, how do we change that, and how do we move forward from that sort of fear that's suppressing us from striving forward?
That's a good question. What if we have to do it and be afraid at the same time, right? Which is not necessarily what you want to hear, but maybe we're going to be afraid of hurt and of failure. So maybe we have to be okay with that. And maybe we need to be thinking about the kinds of choices that we make all around us, the small kinds of choices that have big differences, right? So I'm going to give you one little example, and I'm giving you a slightly kind of reflects my age. But there's a lot of research today that talks about the kinds of, the ways in which nutrition is crucial for a fetus and a young baby, right? Absolutely crucial, right? You have to have healthy food or your brain doesn't develop, even in whatever, utero, that's the word, right? So when you think about that, both literally, but also as metaphor, then you think about, all right, so what's the nutrition I need, right? What are the choices I need? And that's both literally about, right? So I have to take care of myself, I have to eat salad, but I have to also do lots of metaphoric salad in the books that I read, in the social circles, in the places I find that nourish me. Because the more nourished we are, literally, the stronger we are, but also in these other kinds of ways, right? And it's not very practical, but in some ways it is, because again, it's the thing that you can do yourself, right? I can make better choices about what I eat. I don't always want to. Follow up if that was just completely not what you were asking me.
Thank you so much for your words. I just had a question because we're college students here. I'm thinking about, and you said that you spoke to some professors earlier, so I'm thinking a lot about pedagogy and how, like, I'm an accounting major at school. If I don't take a comm class or a communications class, I don't really hear this often. What suggestions maybe that you had for professors today to incorporate this in different disciplines?
Yeah, that is a really good question. And there are folks that are doing this across all disciplines, even in the hard sciences. I'm not sure I completely understand how they do, and in math, right? But there are ways to teach issues of systemic injustice and social change, even in courses like math, engineering, and the hard sciences. You all have a requirement, an intercultural requirement, right? Sometimes you can do things that make these requirements, that weave these requirements through your coursework more fully, right? And this is hard, this is big change, right? But it's the kind of big sphere of influence change that then means that you have these conversations in lots of different classes. So the more that, and the good news is I talked with, 30 faculty today who are all doing this stuff and who are all excited about doing this kind of stuff. But the more that you have those kinds of requirements, then the more that you have courses in which you're having these conversations, right? So that's number one. But number two, the thing that you do in the meantime while Brandon and Dr. Putnam and others are working on the structural change is you talk to them about, so what class should I take? And they direct you because they know who's teaching what kinds of classes. And they say, well, you want some more of this? Let me send you to this class. Let me send you to this class. Let me send you to this class, right? We as faculty and staff are resources that you use to help you navigate these halls, but not just in like sort of graduation requirements, but we kind of know the social landscape and we can direct you here versus there, this course versus that course, as a ways to help you get more opportunities to have this. So tap us individually, but also when you tap us, say, we want more of this, right? That is how these requirements come up in lots of different campuses, is they are student-driven petitions that change the curriculum. So that when I was at the University of Utah, they were instituting a social justice major. Right? It was an interdisciplinary major, and you were going to be able to add it on, and you were going to have these conversations across, and they were going to take you through the structural stuff in education, and in government, and in politics, and in international relations, and in communication, and it was really cool stuff, right? But it was a student-driven thing, right?
You mentioned Melissa Harris Perry earlier, and it made me think of some of the criticism that she faces, and the first is every time she talks about injustice, they call her the angry black woman. And so my question is, as a black woman, how do you point at injustice and say that's not fair and still not sound like the angry black woman?
Right, that's a hard one, because part of me wants to say, just sound like the angry black woman. But when you do that, right, then nobody listens, right? And then you're just the angry black woman. So how do you do that? So maybe it's sort of like the fear thing, right? It is almost inescapable. It is almost before you open your mouth, before you've done anything with your body, that you could say it in the sweetest, nicest terms, right? and you would still be the angry black woman, right? So part of you have to say, all right, I cannot control that narrative that's out there, because that's the narrative that we want to disrupt, the angry black woman, right? We need to disrupt that narrative. And then how else do you do it, man? You got to be smart and know your stuff, right? That's how she does it. That's how she does it, right?
Well, folks, Professor Flores has worked very hard for us today. It's 9 o'clock, so I think we should cut this line. But I do want to announce this quickly. The Communication Club will be hosting a meet and greet with Professor Flores on Wednesday at 10 o'clock. It's specifically for folks to come business, but you know what? If you want to hang out with her, show up. There'll be donuts. And one last time, let's thank her.
Thank you very much.